Northern China. You're standing in a village square. The sun is burning the back of your neck. Dust coats your throat. A man you've never seen before tilts your chin toward the sunlight, runs his thumb across your jawline, opens your mouth and counts your teeth. The way a farmer checks a horse before buying it. Your hands are pulled forward. He examines your fingers, squeezes the tips, bends each one, turns your palms over, and traces the lines like he's reading a map of your future. A future he's about to purchase. He turns to your father, says a number. Your mother collapses behind you. Your father doesn't look at you. He just holds out his hand. Coins drop into his palm. And just like that, you don't belong to your family anymore. You don't understand what's happening. You don't know where you're going. All you know is that your mother is screaming your name, and your father is standing perfectly still, staring at the ground, refusing to meet your eyes. The man takes your hand, pulls you forward. You look back one last time. Your mother reaches for you. Someone holds her back. You will never see this village again. You will never hear your real name spoken out loud again. Because in the imperial courts of China, there was a system that lasted for over 2,000 years. A system so embedded in the culture that historians recorded it the same way they recorded tax policy. Routine, normal, ordinary. They were called nanong, male favorites. Young men purchased, trained, and kept as personal companions for emperors, nobles, and wealthy officials. And what happened to them inside the walls of Chinese palaces was so carefully hidden that the world forgot it ever existed until now. If this story grips you, drop a like and subscribe. It takes a second and helps us keep digging up the histories that empires tried to bury. The system began with hunger. The Han Dynasty ruled China for over 400 years. During that time, famines hit entire provinces every few years. The Yellow River flooded. Monsoons failed. Crops rotted in the fields. And when a family ran out of grain, out of livestock, out of everything they owned, they started making decisions no parent should ever have to make. Professional scouts traveled through the poorest regions of the empire. They had a name for these scouts, Rena. It translates to human teeth. Human teeth. That's what they called the men whose job it was to find young people worth buying. They searched for specific things: clear skin, bright eyes, delicate bone structure, a voice that could carry a melody. But it wasn't just about appearance. They wanted intelligence. They wanted someone who could learn fast, who could memorize poetry, who could hold a conversation with a man who ruled a province. Because the buyers weren't looking for servants. They were looking for companions. And companions needed to be impressive. The inspection process was humiliating. Young men were lined up and examined in front of their families. Hands were checked for artistic potential. Long fingers meant they could learn to play the gutchen, a 7-stringed instrument considered essential in any educated household. Scouts studied bone structure, believing they could predict how someone would look in 5 years. Those who passed were taken immediately. Contracts were written in classical Chinese that most farming families couldn't read. A father would mark a document with his seal or simply nod in agreement, signing away his son for 10 to 15 years of service. Most didn't understand the terms. The ones who did understood there was no other choice. But here's the part that no one talks about. Most of them never came home, not because the contracts kept them, but because by the time their terms ended, there was nothing left of the person they used to be. First thing they took was your name. You walked through the doors of a training house carrying everything you had: a pair of sandals, a wooden comb your mother gave you, and a name that connected you to a family, a village, a life. Within hours, all of it was gone. Each one received a new name, something ornamental, something designed to sound expensive. Precious jade, autumn moon, morning frost. These weren't terms of affection. They were labels. Product names designed to make the merchandise more appealing to wealthy buyers. Your head was shaved. You were dressed in silk robes that marked you as property, not a person. And from that moment forward, every hour of your existence was controlled by someone else. But wait, it gets worse. The training program was sophisticated, and that's what made it so devastating. They weren't being prepared for simple household work. They were being shaped into the most refined companions money could buy. They memorized thousands of verses of classical Chinese poetry, They practiced calligraphy until their brush strokes were flawless. They learned to play instruments, to dance, to sing. They studied medicine, accounting, even political philosophy. Anything that might make them more valuable at auction. And all of this sounds almost civilized until you understand what was happening underneath the education. The real curriculum was psychological destruction. Any expression of homesickness was corrected through punishment. Any sign of independence was treated as a defect. Any memory of home, of family, of who you used to be, was systematically dismantled until you genuinely believed that your only purpose in the world was to please your future master. That was the goal. Not obedience, belief. They needed people who didn't just comply. They needed people who had forgotten there was any other way to exist. According to records from the Tang dynasty, which ruled from 618 to 97 AD, the cost of this process was staggering. Historical accounts suggest that roughly 4 out of every 10 young men purchased for training did not survive to become actual concubines. 4 out of 10, they were consumed by exhaustion, by malnutrition, by the sheer psychological weight of having their entire identity erased before they were old enough to understand what identity even meant. The ones who didn't make it were buried without markers. Their families were never contacted. They just disappeared as if they had never been born. And here's what keeps me up about this part of the story. We're not talking about a war. We're not talking about a plague. We're talking about a business model that factored in a 40% loss rate and considered it acceptable. They knew. The trainers knew. The scouts knew. The families knew. And the system kept running for centuries because the math worked for everyone except the people being sold. This wasn't random cruelty. This was an industry. Scouts earned commissions. Trainers charged fees, and human beings were priced according to a market that valued youth, beauty, and obedience above everything else, including their lives. For the survivors, the reward was a different kind of prison. Their quarters reflected their impossible position. Better than servants, less than wives. Decorated rooms with silk curtains, jade ornaments, and fine furniture. Beautiful, comfortable, and locked from the outside. Think about that for a moment. Silk on the walls, iron on the doors. Daily life was an endless performance. They woke before dawn to spend hours preparing themselves. Cosmetics, clothing, hair. Everything had to be perfect because you never knew when you'd be summoned. And showing up unprepared was the fastest way to fall from favor. And falling from favor in this world didn't mean getting reassigned. It meant being replaced, discarded, thrown out with nothing but the clothes on your back and no skills. No connections, no family willing to acknowledge you existed. At 20 years old, your useful life was considered over. At 25, you were invisible. Competition between concubines in the same household was vicious. Masters deliberately set them against each other, rewarding the most entertaining, punishing whoever pleased the least. Trust was impossible. Friendship was dangerous. The person sleeping in the room next to yours would betray you in a heartbeat, if it meant one more week in the master's good graces. Older concubines who had survived years in the system became ruthless themselves, because they had learned the only rule that mattered. Weakness gets you replaced. Food was another weapon. Favorites received delicacies. Those who had fallen out of favor survived on scraps. Your physical appearance was the only thing standing between you and catastrophe, and your master controlled whether you ate well enough to maintain it. And here's what the official histories leave out completely. Many turned to numbing agents to cope. Certain remedies were easily available in wealthy households, and they offered the only escape from the psychological torment of daily life in the system. The dependency made them even more trapped, even more controlled, which of course was the point. The toll was devastating. Though records routinely covered up the circumstances, Ming Dynasty accounts reference multiple cases of young men who simply could not endure any longer. These losses were reported as accidents to protect the household's reputation, because in this system, even your final act of defiance was something they could erase. Now, everything I've just described happened in private households across China. But inside the imperial palace, this system operated on an entirely different scale. According to historian Brett Hinch, who wrote what academics consider the definitive study on this subject, all 10 emperors during the first 2 centuries of the Han dynasty had documented male favorites. All 10. This wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a secret. It was recorded in official government histories like routine administrative business. But one story stands above all the others. And it's a story that changed the Chinese language itself. His name was Dong Xian. He entered the imperial court around 4 BC, the son of a minor official, roughly 17 years old. The Book of Han, one of China's most important historical texts, describes him as having a face like white jade and eyes that sparkled. Emperor, I noticed him during a routine court ceremony, and from that moment the emperor's obsession consumed the entire government. The gifts came first. Estates, titles, treasure worth what would be millions today. Dongjian's father was made a marquess. His sister was brought into the imperial harem. An entire residence rivaling the imperial palace itself was constructed just for him. Then came the political appointments. Anyone who objected was crushed. The prime minister, Wang Zhe, wrote a carefully worded letter, warning the emperor that his generosity toward Dong Zhen was dangerous. He pointed to history. He reminded the emperor what had happened to Deng Tong, Emperor Wen's favorite from a century earlier. That story alone is worth telling because it's the perfect warning that nobody ever listened to. Dong Tong started as a boatman, a nobody. Emperor Wen noticed him because of a dream. The emperor dreamed he was trying to reach heaven, but couldn't get there until a man wearing a yellow hat pushed him upward. When he woke, he searched the palace and found Dong Tong, a boat rower who wore a yellow cap. The resemblance to the dream was enough. From that day forward, Deng Tong became the emperor's closest companion. The rewards were absurd. Deng Tong was given a copper mine and the right to mint his own currency. His coins, known as Deng Tong coins, circulated across the entire empire. He became wealthier than princes. He was so devoted to the emperor that when Emperor Wen developed a painful wound, Dong Tong personally cleaned it with his own mouth. Not even the crown prince was willing to do that. A fortune teller once examined Deng Tong and announced that he would die of starvation. Emperor Wen laughed. "I'm the one who made him rich," he said. "How could he possibly starve?" But when Emperor Wen passed away, his heir confiscated everything overnight. Every coin, every property, every title. The new emperor remembered the humiliation of being shown up by a commoner at his own father's bedside, and he made Deng Tong pay for it. The richest man in China died on the streets, penniless from starvation, exactly as the fortune teller had predicted. But emperors don't live forever, and when they go, their favorites go with them. Prime Minister Wang Jia tried to warn Emperor Ai of the same pattern. Emperor Ai's response: he had the prime minister arrested on fabricated charges. Wang Jia did not survive the imprisonment. By 1 BC, Dong Xian was appointed supreme commander of the armed forces. He was 22 years old. No military training, no battlefield experience. The most powerful military position in China, given to a man whose only qualification was that the emperor couldn't stand to be away from him. And then came the moment that would define Chinese culture for the next 2,000 years. Picture this: a quiet afternoon in the imperial chambers. Emperor Ai and Dong Xian lying side by side on a mat after a midday meal. Dong Xian falls asleep. His head slowly comes to rest on the sleeve of the emperor's robe. Emperor Ai needs to get up. Court business waits for no one, not even emperors. He looks down at Dong Xian, sleeping peacefully on his sleeve. He could wake him. Any reasonable person would. Instead, Emperor Ai reaches for a blade and carefully, silently cuts off his own imperial sleeve rather than disturb Donggen's rest. That single act became the most famous love story in Chinese history. The story spread through the court overnight. Officials began cutting their own sleeves in imitation. The phrase "the passion of the cut sleeve" became the standard Chinese expression for this kind of devotion. It remained in common use for over 2 millennia. It's still recognized today. But here's where the story breaks. And I mean it breaks completely. Emperor I collapsed in August of 1 BC. He was 26. Reports suggest he had been in declining health for months. But the court was unprepared for how fast it happened. On his deathbed, with barely enough strength to speak, he gave an order that shocked everyone in the room. Pass the throne to Dong Xian. The Grand Empress Daja moved within hours. She seized the imperial seal, reinstated Wang Mang as regent, and stripped Dong Zan of every title, every rank, every possession he had accumulated over the past 5 years. On the same day, he lost everything. Dong Shan and his wife were both found dead before sunset. The most powerful man in China woke up that morning in a palace. By sunset, he was gone. Because in this system, a favorite's power lasted exactly as long as his emperor's heartbeat. Not 1 second longer. And I think that's the cruelest part of this entire story. Not the poverty that started it. Not the training that broke them. It's the illusion. The system let you believe you had made it. It dressed you in silk, gave you a title, put you next to the most powerful person on earth. And then in the span of a single afternoon, it reminded you that none of it was ever yours. You were never powerful. You were never safe. You were decoration. And decorations get replaced. Before we continue, I want to know, what do you think about everything you've heard so far? Drop it in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. Dong Zhen's fate was not unique. It was the pattern. Dong Tong starved to death after his emperor died. Han Yan, favorite of Emperor Wu, was granted free access to the imperial harem itself. He was executed by the Empress Daja for overstepping his position. This cycle repeated for centuries. Every dynasty, every generation. The favorites rose, the emperors fell, and the men who had been given everything were stripped of everything. The moment the throne changed hands, the hypocrisy was staggering. Confucian scholars wrote entire volumes about virtue, duty, and moral governance while purchasing young men from starving families. Buddhist monks preached detachment from worldly desires while hiding favorites in monastery quarters. Government officials passed laws regulating the practice while participating in it themselves. The system didn't just exist alongside Chinese morality. It existed because of Chinese power structures. Favorites were political tools, rewards, weapons, symbols of an emperor's ability to do whatever he pleased without consequence. 500 years after Dongzhan, the Ming Dynasty Emperor Zheng took this tradition to its most extreme conclusion. He abandoned the Forbidden City entirely. Think about that. The most secure, most powerful building in the world. And he walked out of it because it wasn't entertaining enough. He built a 200-room complex known as the Leopard Quarter, a private palace constructed next to the Imperial Zoo. He filled it with companions, performers, monks, wrestlers, and favorites gathered from across the empire. He surrounded himself with a group of eunuchs known as the Eight, tigers who controlled access to the emperor and through him the entire government. He lived there from 1508 until his passing in 1521, 13 years. 13 years conducting the business of an empire between hunts in the zoo and elaborate celebrations that scandalized the entire court. Ministers who needed the emperor's signature on essential documents had to navigate the zoo to find him. When officials protested, he had them beaten. According to the Cambridge History of China, between 12 and 14 of them did not survive the punishment. And the pattern held. When Jin passed away at 29 after falling from a boat, his successor dismantled the Leopard Quarter immediately. Every favorite, every companion, every performer recalled punished, exiled. 70 chests of gold and 2,200 chests of silver were confiscated from a single one of his associates. 2,000 years of the same story. Rise, fall, erasure, repeat. The practice finally declined during the fall of the Qing dynasty. The revolution of 1911 ended the imperial system, and with it, much of the aristocratic world that had sustained this tradition for millennia. The communist victory in 1949 brought even harsher consequences. Former concubines were interrogated during political campaigns, forced to testify against their former masters. Some were punished as symbols of the old feudal system. Others were sent to labor camps. The revolution that was supposed to liberate the oppressed simply found new ways to use the same people the old system had already destroyed. But what happened to the last generation of male concubines? Mostly silence. They were abandoned by masters who feared the new government, left without resources, without skills for independent survival, without anyone who would claim to know them. Some vanished into China's vast population, carrying their stories with them into obscurity. Others didn't survive the transition at all. And here's what stays with me about this entire history. We know the names of the emperors. We know the names of the favorites who reached the top. Dong Xian, Dong Tong, Han Yan. We even know the name of Dong Xian's wife, who chose to leave this world beside him on the day everything collapsed. But the nameless ones, the ones who were sold from their villages and buried without markers before they ever reached adulthood. The ones who survived training only to be thrown away when their youth faded. The ones who spent their final years begging on streets they didn't recognize, in cities they were brought to against their will, carrying names that weren't even theirs. We don't know a single one of their names. 2,000 years of this system. Millions of families who made the same impossible choice. Millions of young men who walked through those doors and never walked back out. And the system was so thorough, so efficient, so carefully designed that it erased even the memory of the people it consumed. That's not just cruelty, that's engineering. This is crown and dagger. We don't clean up history. We show you what actually happened. Subscribe if you believe these stories deserve to be heard. And tell me in the comments, did you know any of this before?